Good morning. I'm Anthony Romero, the National Director of the ACLU. Thank you all for joining us here this morning and on the phone. Today we announce one of the most significant pieces of litigation that the ACLU has brought over the past 4 years. This is the first case of its type where homeowners are holding investment banks accountable for the subprime lending debacle. It literally is the first case of Main Street holding Wall Street accountable for the abuses that happened in the aftermath of the Great Recession that impacted millions of Americans and specifically impacted racial minorities in the loss of their houses and homes by shoddy lending practices. We have a report that's available to you online called Justice Foreclosed. It's also here in the back of the room. The report tells the compelling story of two families of how we got here today and the impact on their personal lives. I want to thank the ACLU lawyers who literally put in thousands of hours into this lawsuit, the first of its kind. With Dennis Parker, the director of our Racial Justice Project, with Larry Schwartzall, after all the late nights and the great work and the great legal thinking, we're pleased to be here to bring the story of accountability to the American people. We could not have done this case also without our colleagues at the National Consumer Law Center with Stuart Rossman, who you'll hear from today. And we're also especially grateful to the law firm of Lieff, Cabraser, Heimann, and Bernstein, joined by Elizabeth Cabraser, who will also speak to you. There are others in the ACLU family, including our ACLU of Michigan office, Michael Steinberg, and most of the team from Detroit is here present with us today, including Sarah Mehta, who's here in the room. This case really is about the beginning of reconciling ourselves to the impact of the Great Recession. Millions of Americans lost values in their pension funds and their retirement accounts. But also, as importantly, thousands of racial and ethnic minorities lost their homes by shoddy lending practices that had a disparate impact on racial and ethnic minority communities. The efforts to hold Wall Street accountable have been marked in the recent efforts by government to litigate against the banks and some of the lenders. But yet this first case of individual homeowners who have stood up and asserted their rights is notable in the fact that they claim justice and accountability in ways that have yet not been heard. I want to turn over now the description of the litigation to Stuart Rossman, Director of Litigation at National Consumer Law Center, and then afterwards we'll hear from other speakers as well.
Thank you, Anthony. My name is Stuart Rossman, and I am the Director of Litigation at the National Consumer Law Center. And we are pleased to be here today with our colleagues, our dedicated colleagues, both from the ACLU and from the law firm of Lieff, Cabraser, Heimann, and Bernstein. The National Consumer Law Center is a 43-year-old public interest nonprofit organization dedicated to representing low-income and elderly consumers. We are recognized experts in a broad range of state and federal consumer laws and how they apply in the marketplace. And included in our analyses are the inner workings of the mortgage finance industry and the incentives of various financial institutions that created the current mortgage foreclosure crisis. Throughout our existence, we have lived by the philosophy that economic justice is a civil right. We have a long-standing commitment to fighting marketplace injustices aimed at families and communities of color. For example, our groundbreaking litigation challenging discrimination in the auto finance industry, in the subprime mortgage lending industry, has directly tackled practices and policies that drain billions of dollars from communities of color. Economic justice as a civil rights is also a core of the Fair Housing Act and the Equal Credit Opportunity Act, the federal laws that we claim that Morgan Stanley violated. In passing those laws, Congress recognized and sought remedies for the economic effects of this country's unfortunate history of discrimination by forbidding discrimination in any aspect of the residential real estate transactions and credit transactions. These two laws place a burden on Morgan Stanley and other investment banks to make sure that their practices and procedures provide a level playing field for all consumers. Congress recognized that it's not enough to merely outlaw overt racism, like refusing to make a loan to someone or to sell a home to someone merely because of their race, their ethnicity, their age, or their sex. But it's also necessary to monitor all the practices and procedures, even those that appear to be neutral on their face, to ensure that they do not perpetuate and magnify the historical patterns of racism and discrimination that exist in our community. Morgan Stanley was involved in providing upfront lending and dictating the terms of high cost, high risk, high rate of return loans it wanted from mortgagees like New Century Bank for its securitized pools of mortgage debt, which it could then sell on Wall Street. It didn't care where the loans came from or who was affected, as long as their insatiable desire for ever-increasing profit margins were fulfilled. You might ask, who would ever buy such toxic products? And the answer is only someone who had no other choice. Ultimately, it was the minority residents of the historically segregated Metro Detroit area who had been subjected to decades of housing and lending discrimination and had fewer alternative sources of credit in an uncompetitive market that became the inevitable targets for the high-cost mortgages with unreasonably high foreclosure rates. Today, we seek to hold Morgan Stanley responsible for its acts. We seek to have the court enjoin Morgan Stanley's policies that cause this discriminatory impact and to force the company to give up the unjust enrichment it earned from its practices. These remedies will help all consumers, not just the victims of discrimination, in the Detroit area by holding Morgan Stanley responsible for the destructive financial products it unleashed in the community. I'd like to close my statement by asking a question that actually my wife asked me before I came here today. She wanted to know why we were filing this lawsuit in New York instead of Detroit. And the answer, there are a lot of answers, but the one that I gave her was that we have decided to bring this controversy right to Morgan Stanley's doorstep on Wall Street. For years, the plaintiffs and their neighbors in Detroit have been invisible to Morgan Stanley. For decades, they were ignored, shut off from access to credit, and denied reasonable financial resources to build their assets. Then when it became possible for toxic loan products to be bundled into pools of securities in order to earn egregious profits, Morgan Stanley used its enormous financial power to market the high-cost mortgages without ever having to encourage the consumers who had them foisted upon them by having mortgagees like New Century do their dirty work for them. The homeowners never even knew that Morgan Stanley was the hidden force behind their transactions. Finally, when the collapse of the real estate market wreaked havoc on Detroit's neighborhoods, Morgan Stanley acted with impunity as if it had no responsibility or obligation to the people whose homes were lost, whose communities were destroyed, and whose savings were pilfered. So we have decided to enter the belly of the beast, to bring the ramifications of its policies home to Morgan Stanley. That is why Ruby McCoy, who we'll be hearing from shortly, and the other named plaintiffs are here to confront Morgan Stanley with the tremendous harm they have caused to them. That is why their neighbors and the proposed class are here to demand justice for their decimated communities in metropolitan Detroit. And that is why this case has been filed here to hold Morgan Stanley legally liable for its avaricious practices. They are real, they are visible, and they will be ignored no more. Thank you very much.
And now I'm pleased to introduce Elizabeth Cabraser, named partner of the law firm Lieff, Cabraser, Heimann Bernstein. Few law firms in the nation have as much experience representing clients in class action suits seeking justice on important issues. Please, Ms. Cabraser.
Thank you very much, and good morning, everyone. We at Lieff Cabraser are very proud to partner with the ACLU and the National Consumer Law Center to have the privilege of representing the brave plaintiffs, and there's no other word for it, from Detroit, Ruby McCoy and the other plaintiffs who are bringing this case here, as Stuart said, in New York, to confront Morgan Stanley and hold it accountable for the thoughtless, callous, profit-driven practices that have devastated the Detroit area and so many other main streets across the country. Lieff Cabraser represents investors, and we represent employees, and we represent consumers. And I have never seen such a situation in which a vicious cycle of greed has managed to victimize so many groups. This practice victimized investors. It brought down our national economy, and it destroyed the hopes and dreams of many working and striving Americans across the country. And Detroit is the tragic symbol and ground zero of that debacle. It has been said that the dark side of liberty is greed, and we are a country of liberty. We allow unparalleled economic freedom to build our country, but we have a social contract that is the basis of our country that says we do it together and that we are accountable to each other. And our history has been a long struggle to bring more people into that social contract, to enable them to participate in the American dream. What Morgan Stanley and others did has been an incredible setback to that American dream because it flouted our social contract and exploited hardworking people and treated them as fodder, as collateral damage, as the raw product of a pooled mortgage investment machine. There was an insatiable appetite for mortgages to form the pools, to feed the market, and to bring in the unprecedented profits. These loans were mass-produced, and they were built to order, not to serve homeowners or to comply with responsible lending practices, but to ensure a steady stream of product for the market. And unlike the production lines that built and brought prosperity to Detroit, this mass production has impoverished the Detroit area and has devastated the Detroit community. The targeting of communities of color as raw material for loans designed to attract investors while trapping homeowners in a vicious cycle of debt and foreclosure is quintessential reverse redlining. It violates the Federal Fair Housing Act, the Equal Credit Opportunity Act, and Michigan's own Civil Rights Act, as Mr. Rossman described. This is a nation of liberty, and it is a nation of laws. And it is the duty and the privilege of public interest groups, of lawyers, and of Americans themselves to utilize those laws to restore the balance, to enforce the social contract, and to ensure that our economy works for everyone. We are so proud this morning to join the plaintiffs and lawyers in this suit as one small part of this ongoing project. Thank you.
And finally, one of our plaintiffs who has come from Detroit to New York, Ruby McCoy, will now speak. As Elizabeth mentioned, this case is more than just the loss of billions of dollars. It's more than just the loss of thousands of houses and homes. It's the loss of the American dream. And it takes individuals who've been wronged to have the courage to stand up and seek remedy and seek justice. We, the lawyers, have the easy job. to take the laws on the books as they exist and to apply them in everyday circumstances. The hard job is for the person who's been wronged to stand up and have the courage to demand justice and demand an end of practices so that their case and the cases of others will be remedied. We're really thrilled to have Ruby McCoy here address this case and her own personal story, and then we'll open up for questions to everyone in the audience and on the phone. Please, Ruby.
Good morning. Thank you. My name is Ruby McCoy. I was born and raised in Detroit, Michigan. I currently reside in Detroit, Michigan with my 4 children and 2 nephews that I also take care of. I'm proud to say that I have 1 son who is in his 3rd year at a 4-year university. I have 2 other sons who graduated high school and are now attending community college. And I have 3 other children at home who have very high hopes of going to college one day. I rented for many years, and I found that renting didn't give me the stability I wanted for my children. So when I had the opportunity to purchase the house I was renting, I was excited about becoming a homeowner and having a valuable asset that me and my children can appreciate. It meant giving them a more stable life, their own bedrooms, backyard to play in. We had our own basement and a garage. So it was a lot it meant a lot for us to have a home. We spent many Christmases in this house, baking cookies, sipping hot chocolate by the fireplace, and singing songs with our friends and families every year. And every year, everybody would ask me, they would call me up and say, Ruby, are we having hot chocolate and crafts at your house this year? And of course, the answer was always yes. One of my sons just reminded me the other day, just before I left, that we lived in this house since he was in the 4th grade. And he's in his 1st year of college now. So it was a long time. They grew up here. And when I grew up, I would always hear people say things like, it takes a village to raise a child. And I experienced that when we would come home from school and our neighbors would let us stay at their house until our parents came home. And I wanted the same thing for my kids. So when I purchased the house, I had that. And I slowly saw this diminish as the people in my neighborhood began to lose their homes. I always taught my kids that having a house was a privilege, and it was something that we needed to take care of, even though we saw the devastation going on in the neighborhood around us. We still value what we had. In the past 12 months, I've been under an enormous amount of stress trying to shield the mortgage situation from my children while trying to keep the house that we've lived in for so many years. I didn't want this to be a burden to my children. I wanted them to just be kids and concentrate on school and just being the best that they can be. But a couple weeks ago, I had to tell them about the mortgage situation I was in. When my daughter came home, she was so excited because she had bought a Phineas and Ferb key, and she loves Phineas and Ferb. So she bought the key, and she came home and she showed it to me, and she said, Mom, look at my key I bought for the house. So I had no choice but to tell them what was going on. It was kind of hard for me to explain to my children about the situation I was in with the mortgage. It was hard for me to explain to them as well as to my family because I don't quite understand the situation myself. So I'm here today just to I'm sorry. I'm sorry.
So we're here today to make sure that the lending practices of Morgan Stanley that led to the ruin of so many families, including the troubles of Ruby McCoy's family, get discussed, get understood, and more importantly, get remedied. The courage of a Ruby McCoy to be able to stand up to her family and friends and say, what happened to us is wrong. And there are individuals responsible for these shoddy lending practices that led to the decimation of entire communities and the struggles of families is the reason why we're thrilled to bring this lawsuit, to give you and your family some peace of mind, Ruby, and to give you the sense that injustice, when committed, needs to be righted. Thank you. We'll take your questions now.
Thank you.
For those of you in the room who wish to ask questions, you can raise your hand and identify yourself. Or Stephen, are we going to go first to the questions in the audience, on the phone? The woman in the back here, please, if you could just tell us who you are and who you represent.
I'm Emily Flitter, I represent Reuters News, and I'm wondering if you see Morgan Stanley as unique, or do you plan on bringing actions like these against many other banks on Wall Street?
We begin, and I will call on Larry to give you fuller explanation of how we got into this case and the research we did. It was a laborious process bringing us to this lawsuit. Certainly we begin with the Morgan Stanley instance. That's what we are litigating today. That's what the complaint alleges. It's a case where we think the facts are rather clear about the violations of both federal and state law and the targeting and the impact on minority communities in ways that is unconstitutional and illegal. But by no means is Morgan Stanley the only bank for which this has been a problem. And so clearly this is the beginning of an exploration for us, for other lawyers, for our legislators. But perhaps, Larry, if you can just share a little bit of light about how we looked into other banks and the impact specifically on Morgan Stanley.
Thank you. I'm Larry Schwartz-Toll. I'm a staff attorney in the Racial Justice Program here at the ACLU. Before filing this case, we conducted an extensive and intensive investigation of Morgan Stanley's securitization practices and the direct line of causation connecting the practices that Morgan Stanley was conducting in creating mortgage-backed securities and the impact on neighborhoods and families in Detroit. And so this is reflected in the complaint that was filed today, which tells a really stark narrative of the close working relationship between Morgan Stanley and New Century, describes the ways in which Morgan Stanley pressed on the lever whenever it could with New Century to encourage it to create toxic, high-risk loans, and documents the racial disparities that have resulted in Detroit and in the Detroit region, the county surrounding Detroit. We think that the practices that that drove this lawsuit were endemic of that industry during the subprime lending boom. We don't think that Morgan Stanley was the only bank that was operating according to this basic set of incentives and practices. And so as Anthony said, one of the things that we hope this lawsuit will do is to make very clear that investment banks, when they interact with the home mortgage market, are subject to the federal anti-discrimination laws, and that their practices should be closely scrutinized, and the impact of their practices should be closely scrutinized, because when they violate the Fair Housing Act and the Equal Credit Opportunity Act, they should be held accountable.
The only thing I would add to this, and perhaps Stuart or Elizabeth would you wish to add, is that while there have been other pieces of litigation brought by the government, both at the federal and state level, that this is the first such lawsuit brought by homeowners against an investment bank. And we hope that the courage exhibited by Ruby McCoy will bring other homeowners who have lost their homes, who've been victimized by the banks, to also give them courage to step forward and to challenge those lending practices as well. But Stuart or Elizabeth, do you wish to add anything, please?
Just to follow up briefly, what is unique about this case, and Elizabeth alluded to it as well, is that this is a reverse redlining case. This was a community that for decades banks would not go in and provide funding and mortgages. And when they had the toxic product, they were directing their attentions on those communities. What is unique here is that Morgan Stanley instigated this entire process by making the high demands for these types of mortgages that they could bundle as securities on Wall Street, and then provided the funding that enabled them to be placed, and directly participated with New Century in ensuring that the terms that they were looking for were being met in these pools. Yet for all of that, you can take a look at all of the registry documents. Morgan Stanley doesn't appear there. They were the wizard behind the screen. And what is unique about this case is that we're pulling that curtain back and we're showing the actual party that was the one that was really orchestrating the sales of these products in Detroit and around the country. I think Larry's absolutely right. This was endemic, but the reason why we chose Detroit is that we have one investment bank, one primary subprime lender, predatory lender, and one community that is the exemplar of what was wrong with this entire system. And we're going to use this case to be able to demonstrate why this violates the law in the hopes and the expectations that it will establish precedents that can be applied throughout the country.
Do we have anyone else here in the room?
Question on the phone?
Sir, I'm sorry, there's a gentleman here. If you can tell us who you are and...
I'm sorry, I'm Mark Lenihan with the Associated Press. I'm just asking, Ruby, are you still in your house or are you no longer in your house?
I am still in the house.
And you expected then to be able to remain for a period of
Well,
time?
I think that's a question best for the lawyers in terms of what we are hoping to seek in terms of a remedy. I mean, Ruby's case is one where we're seeking to hold the banks accountable on behalf of her and the other 4 named plaintiffs in the lawsuit. We're seeking both a recognition that this was in violation of the federal and state civil rights laws, and then as Stuart described, there is an element of the litigation which I'll leave to the litigators to describe to you in much greater detail on disgorgement. The fact that the banks wrongfully padded their bank accounts on such shoddy practices will then provide remedies to the individual victims. This is why this case is so significant. It's the first time of the actual victims of the mortgage-backed securities debacle who stand forward and seek direct remedy and justice. And so ultimately, what the remedy will be, what the impact will be for Ruby and for the other families in the class action will be determined by the remedy we're able to secure.
Morgan Stanley has begun a formal foreclosure process against...
I'm sorry, say that once again.
Has Morgan Stanley started a formal foreclosure process?
I think
As former Morgan Stanley.
I'm sorry. Has Morgan Stanley begun a formal foreclosure process against Ruby McCoy?
Okay. Anyone on the phone wishing to identify themselves, please, and then ask a question of us here in New York?
And once again, if you have a question over the phone, please press star followed by 1 this time. Star followed by 1. Please stand by.
Anyone else in the audience wishing to ask a follow-up question? Please, yeah.
Sorry, do you have
And you're once again still from Reuters, and your first name again.
Still Emily from
Okay.
Reuters. Can you name some other banks that you kind of are looking to go after next? Or investment banks?
You know, I think it's premature to say which other banks we're looking at. I think it's clear to say that all the banks that have been the subject of some litigation by the government and by the Department of Justice are all now, we're looking much more closely at some of their data. I think, again, what's important here is, since this is a case of first impressions, that we wish to establish good precedent here with this clear set of facts and circumstances on how the Morgan Stanley in particular decimated the homes and the lives of individuals in Detroit, that after having established that culpability and that legal precedent could be more broadly applied to other circumstances or other banks. So it's fair to say that this was, by no means was Morgan Stanley the only actor in the subprime lending debacle. By no means was Morgan Stanley the only bank that made a fortune off of the misfortune of millions of Americans. And so we believe that this might be very much the beginning of an effort for Main Street to seek accountability from Wall Street. That's our hope. Yes, please, sir. If you can, or ma'am, can you identify yourself and tell us your question, please?
That question is from the line of Chris Isidori of CNN Money. Please go ahead.
Do you feel that this lawsuit is a sign that the government has not done enough, that this is a suit that should have been brought by the government, or is this something that you would feel would always be in addition to the actions that have been taken by state and federal authorities?
I think it's fair to say, and I'm sure Stuart and Elizabeth will chime in, I think it's fair to say that we're hardened by the recent interests of the federal government to look into such matters. I think it's also true that everyone recognizes that the response to the catastrophic events of the recession of the last 4 years and the impact on homeowners in particular has been at times anemic. I mean, even the Justice Department and the Obama administration itself recognizes that some of their broken promises have to deal with the housing fallout from the Great Recession of 4 years ago. Certainly, if we had felt that the response was as vigorous as it should have been, we would probably not have gone down this path several years ago. The banks have not been held accountable to the homeowners. There have been efforts by shareholders, there have been efforts focused on the predatory lenders, but connecting back to the investment banks is a novelty of this lawsuit. But Stuart, Elizabeth, please, if you wish to chime in.
Sure.
Please.
I just wanted to add that one of the advantages of our legal system, and I am a true believer in the American legal system, is that we needn't rely on the government alone to enforce our laws. The laws under which we're bringing this suit have private rights of action, which enable people like Ruby to stand up and do for themselves and others like them what needs to be done when their experience, their lives, bring them to the point where they know and understand that that is necessary. And so it's a complementary situation. We know that laws are enforced more or less by governments at different times. Politics is inevitable. There's limited funding. And so we have a reservoir of enforcers of our social contract in this country, and that's each and every one of us. So it's an opportunity that we're using here in the form of a class action suit, so that homeowners themselves can stand up and hold those who damage them accountable.
Do we have other questions on the line now?
And we have no further questions from the phone at this time.
Okay. With that, we thank you. The lawyers and all of us involved in litigation will be available to media afterwards if you wish to speak with us privately. Thank you very much. This press conference is now adjourned. Thank you.